So here's a rather interesting thought. Would Frontier Developments ever consider selling the studio to a larger company, maybe such as Microsoft, Sony, or one of the other big studios out there? Now, very recently, yesterday in fact, this very thought was discussed by YouTuber Commander Burr over on the Burr Pit. That video is linked in the video description, so do go check it out. As always, his videos are of a very high quality and always worth watching. So onto the subject itself. What has prompted this? Well, it comes from an article on the website This Is Money, and this was dated in February. So this is certainly an interesting subject and something I really want to cover and just briefly talk about in this particular video. Now, the This Is Money article was all about the state of the video games industry, specifically the recent buyouts by Microsoft and Sony. It went on to speculate which other studios out there might be ripe for purchase. And this speculation was backed by Liberum, who are actually Frontier's financial analysts. So the article kind of concluded with the following statement. A London-listed firm thought to be a potential target is Frontier Developments, which makes popular games based on the Jurassic Park movie franchise, as well as its sci-fi spaceship simulator Elite Dangerous. The company's shares have fallen by nearly 56%. Do remember that particular point, I'll be coming back to it, in the last 12 months, following a series of profit warnings sparking speculation that it could be ripe for a takeover swoop. So this article was posted on the 14th of February, but it's not the only time that This Is Money has actually spoken about this. Previously, they mentioned it back on the 19th of January when they said this. And here again now talking about the recent purchases by other large studios. So the spree seems to set to continue, with more UK firms in the crosshairs. AIM listed Frontier Developments, whose games include the Jurassic Park franchise, is thought by some to be a target due to its successful gaming IPs and a fall in the share price. The stock is down 34% in 6 months. Tencent has been mulled as a potential buyer. Tencent actually have fairly large holdings in Frontier Developments, with 8.6% of the shares. They're second only to David Braben himself, but they're not the only ones with large shareholdings. We've got Swedbank here, as well as Invesco. It's worth keeping in mind that David Braben is by far the largest shareholder of Frontier Developments, with 32.7% of the overall shares, with the board of directors themselves holding a total of 34.3% of the shares, and all of this information is directly from Frontier themselves. So, point here, there's not likely to be any type of hostile takeover here, and no sale would be going ahead without the express wishes of David Braben. Now, speaking of David Braben, it was pointed out in Commander Burr's video, very observant in fact, that David Braben had stopped tweeting on the 11th, I believe, or the 12th of January this year, and he's quite a prolific tweeter. Now this, as Burr points out, may be a complete coincidence, but a part of the speculation there was that the radio silence may be potentially because there is something going on around the table here, some sort of potential deal. But I do have another theory here. As mentioned by the This Is Money articles, Frontier Developments have lost a huge amount of value off their share price. Now, back last year, the company as a whole had a market cap of over £1 billion, very valuable company. As of right now, though, the company is worth slightly over £500 million, so they've lost a significant amount of money in terms of overall value. Now, as some people have pointed out before, the stock market itself is very volatile. A lot of companies are having issues at the moment. But for here, with Frontier Developments, there are some very specific causes that have caused by the company itself. Partly this was due to the botched launch of Odyssey, and another reason is that Frontier have more than once overestimated and overstated their potential future earnings. These future earnings then went on to be far lower than expected when the time turned up, and this in large part was thanks to the poor launch of Elite Dangerous Odyssey, as well as the low sales of the second Jurassic World Evolution game and the poor sales of Lemnis Gate. All of this confirmed by Frontier. This was the case in point on the 12th of January. As soon as that information was made public by Frontier, the share value immediately dropped. So going back to David Braben's tweets, they stopped on the 11th of January. Maybe a coincidence, but I'd be willing to bet there is very likely some sort of relationship here, but who knows what that relationship would actually be. But that, of course, is just speculation, it's opinion. Correlation doesn't always necessarily mean causation after all, so it could be a case of anything else going on here as well. Moving away from that particular point of discussion though, and returning to the subject of the share value, as This Is Money did say, Frontier Developments are now a far cheaper company to potentially purchase than they would have been this time last year. Now, there's another potential issue going on here, and that is, it's quite possible and quite probable in fact that Frontier Developments was just simply overvalued and is now corrected and has returned to a value that the market believes is true and accurate for the potential of the company. So that really does raise another question. Would Frontier Developments be a good purchase for a studio? Would Microsoft, Tencent, Sony, or indeed anyone else consider the studio a worthwhile investment? Well, that's packed up into a number of different points. Firstly, we could look at the number of franchises that Frontier Developments own. After all, when you think of something like Activision Blizzard and Microsoft purchasing them, they actually bought a whole boatload of very, very valuable games. The same is true with Bethesda. Love them or hate them, they own some very, very popular and very valuable franchises. How does that stand with Frontier? Well, Frontier themselves do own Elite Dangerous, of course. They own the Elite franchise, which is pretty popular and it's widely known and has a great history to it. What other franchises do they directly own? They own Planet Zoo and Planet Coaster as well. Arguably, these are pretty good, but perhaps not the best, not multi-billion-dollar selling games, but maybe, something worth throwing in as an added extra. When you turn your attention to Frontier's other titles, Jurassic World Evolution, the upcoming Formula 1, the F1 game, as well as the Age of Sigmar Warhammer game, all of these are licensed titles. These are not franchises that Frontier themselves own. Whilst these could be a good potential investment for any other company, it's worth keeping in mind and worth considering that these licenses could be transferred to any other company at any other moment. And in fact, there's multiple other Warhammer games out there, all being granted by licenses from Games Workshop to other studios for different types of games. And there's no reason to consider that the same wouldn't happen with Jurassic Park or even F1 at some point in the far future. Also, another consideration is the cost of these licenses. They're not going to be cheap. Frontier will have to pay for these, and anyone who purchases Frontier will have to take on those costs. Possibly that would be reflected in the cost of the purchase of the studio, or possibly it would end up being an ongoing cost. Either way, whilst Jurassic World Evolution, F1 and Warhammer do have significant brand recognition, these are not franchises owned by Frontier. Ultimately then, the way I see it, and yes, I'm not an investor, I'm not a stockholder, and I don't really have any financial experience, but the way I see it here is that whilst Frontier certainly have significant brand recognition when it comes to something like Elite Dangerous, they don't have much else in terms of great valuable assets, or great valuable franchises rather. The big asset that they do have is being one of the UK's largest independent studios. They have a lot of infrastructure there, a big studio set up with a lot of ties and well-known recognition within the industry, and that in itself may be worthwhile purchasing. But in many ways it's a moot point. It's kind of speculation by many at this point, even though it's coming from a respectable source, that itself was still speculation. Ultimately, it really comes down to David Braben. Would he want to sell his life's work? Whilst Frontier, in terms of value, has dropped on the market, as it's dropped 50% over the course of the last 12 months, that is a significant drop. There's plenty of opportunity for this to pick up in the future with the release of future games and with the expansion of the company itself. Further, David Braben has discussed in the past his aspirations of building Frontier Developments into a massive, large-scale publisher, perhaps not quite on the scale of Ubisoft, Activision or EA, but certainly along those sort of lines. And if he sells a studio now, then those aspirations are probably not going to be achieved, at least not necessarily by his own hands. So then, at the end of the day, what are my thoughts on this? Well, I would never be surprised by any company, even Frontier Developments, selling out to another company. There's a lot of money to be made, and people own these companies, they're well within their rights to actually go ahead and sell this. There is some good opportunities there, I'd imagine, for other companies to purchase Frontier Developments, but as I said, they don't have the biggest franchises in-house. So for me, it's really a bit of a mixed bag. I don't see it happening anytime soon, but at the same time, I really wouldn't be surprised. Guess it comes down to a flip of a coin if I was going to give my opinion. Could go either way. Another point of thought here about Elite Dangerous specifically. Just imagine Microsoft, for example, come along and purchase Frontier Developments. Remember, something very similar happened with Tomb Raider, and Tomb Raider license was then transferred to another company. Maybe one day in the far future, the same could happen to Elite Dangerous, and the Elite Dangerous franchise, the Elite franchise, be placed in the care and hands of another company. As always, thanks for watching, and I'll catch you guys and girls next time.